We have a cancer close to the presidency that's growing.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Well, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal.
This is a police photograph of James W. McCord. He is one of 5 persons surprised and arrested yesterday inside the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee in Washington. McCord is a former CIA employee. Now he runs his own private security service. And guess what else he is? A consultant to President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign committee. Police say McCord and his accomplices brought electronic listening devices with them to bug the Democrats' office. Today, former Attorney General John Mitchell, the chairman of President Nixon's re-election committee, denied any connection with the incident. McCord and his accomplices, meanwhile, have been charged with second-degree burglary and released on bail. But I don't think that's the last we're going to hear of this story.
Our primary purpose was to ensure that Governor Reagan felt comfortable with the campaign. So we had planned a series of events culminating in a very fancy fundraising dinner at one of the Hollywood stars' homes on a Saturday night.
I wanted it to be an absolutely secure conversation. I still had a White House pass. I went over into the White House and I went into what is known as the Situation Room. There was a KYX scrambler phone over there and it would be available. Well, of course, there's no scrambler phone in the hotel where I'm told Mr. Magruder is. So I called Magruder and I said, look, I need to speak to you securely. There is a missile base, a guided missile base, run by the Air Force, just in such and such a place. Go down there and hit Magruder. Why do I have to go to a missile base? Why do I have to talk to this company? You know? And I said, look, I need to speak to you securely.
All I thought was there's Liddy playing his, little spy games again. And he said, well, my guys got caught last night at the Watergate. And I sort of said something like, well, that's too bad, but, as you and I talked, they're not connected at all with us. He said, well, that was true, but unfortunately, because you put me under such time pressure, I had to ask Jim McCord to help us.
He said, we got a slight PR problem. And I said, well, if it's a PR problem, that's your bailiwick. He said, this is a PR problem that requires a lawyer. Mitchell asked Magruder point blank, how much money did you give Liddy? And Magruder replied, $80,000. Mitchell said, he was aghast. He said, $80,000? And before he finished the sentence, Magruder said, oh, you authorized $200,000. Mitchell's reply was, yes, but the campaign hasn't started yet.
At some point, somebody, I don't know if Mitchell said this or if Marty said it. Hell, I may have said it. Let's call Kleindienst and find out what's going on.
John Mitchell wanted me to get a hold of Richard Kleindienst, who was then the Attorney General of the United States, and to say that he, John Mitchell, wanted Richard Kleindienst to get McCord out of jail because McCord was the security chief of the committee to re-elect the president. Direct connection. Whereupon I said, okay, I don't know whether you've heard about the break-in and thing. And I said, I have to tell you, that was our operation, my operation. I was responsible. He said, oh, God, you know. I said, yep, I made the mistake.
He said, General, he said, John Mitchell told me to tell you to get these people out of jail right now, and I mean right now. And I said, what in the hell do you think you're talking about, Gordon?
You know, Kleindienst was just apoplectic.
I'm not going to do what you said, and if you say anything like that to me again, I'm going to put you in jail.
And I said, yes. I said, I understand. I said, you know, God knows what would happen to you if you do a thing like that. He said, fuck what happens to me. What happens to the President of the United States? I do a stupid thing like that.
When we went into the property room, spread out on the table were electronic devices, walkie-talkies, cameras, a huge amount of film, and a gym bag. Curious that I was, I opened the gym bag and saw more film, and then there was some tissue paper. And I reached in to pull the tissue paper, and out fell a little black device with a couple of wires on it. One of the agents, while assisting the police, was going through the dresser drawer, and being as thorough as he was, you know, just flipping through there, the paper goes up, and there's this envelope.
I had given a letter of mine to Bernie Barker to mail. Asked him to, when he left the hotel room where Lydia and I were, heading out for the elevators, I had asked him to take this letter and drop it in the mail chute.
You want to know why the Post was so good, in addition to Woodward and Bernstein. But it was a police story. It was all happening in a court that the average Washington correspondent, especially from a New York paper, they couldn't find a police court here if they had a map.
I went to the arraignment hearing at the local Superior Court, and they called the 5 burglars in. And the judge asked James McCord, where do you work? And McCord went, kind of. And the judge went, what? Speak up. And McCord went. And the judge said, speak up so I can hear you. And then McCord said, CIA. And my reaction was, holy S.
Whispering to the judge at a hearing that he worked for the CIA. My God, I mean, that just exploded it out. We were lucky. We got a big head start. Police reporter Al Lewis got one of those burglars' little pocket, phone books. And that was the key to the whole thing. And it's a great story. Woodward calls up the White House and asks for this Mr. Hunt. And the operator says, buzzes this way. The operator says, Chuck Colson's office. Boing! Everybody, got that. And she said, nicest woman ever lived, said, oh, Mr. Hunt is not here right now. He's at so-and-so. So then Woodward, in his best accent, calls this number and asks for Hunt.
I'll never forget, he shouted out, good God, and hung up the phone and left town.
So by now, are you interested? Yeah.
Dick's special guest is Senator Edward Kennedy.
Senator Kennedy, there's a thing today that I'd love to get your reaction to. It's just preposterous. They talk about it as the James Bond plot that took place in Washington the night where they found these people sneaking in with eavesdropping devices, and one of them was a CIA man. What diabolical information and secret could there be in there that they would have to go to all that risk and effort to get.
You mean the Democratic National Committee?
Yeah, yeah.
This is enormously desperate kind of an attempt by the, this fellow was the head of security for the committee to re-elect the president, and I don't know really what...
Do you think Attorney General Mitchell knew about these men the other night?
Well, I don't know.
I came over, I saw the Sunday morning papers and saw an item in the Miami Herald. It was the most foolish, useless political caper of all time, because what reason would anybody want to go, if you're going to do any bugging, you're going to bug the Democratic National headquarters.
When I arrived in the office, normal hours on Monday morning, Jeb Magruder called, told me what had happened, told me that Liddy had messed this whole thing up, and that he said, John, I can't talk to Gordon Liddy. You've got to talk to him and find out what happened and why.
I put him completely in the picture in a way so that he, being knowledgeable about these things, Dean could attempt to control the investigation and thereby the damage. I then finally said to him something that disturbed Dean. I had in my head knowledge which could bring down a president of the United States.
Within the White House, I was the president's line to the re-election committee, and Gordon Strachan was my line, and Strachan had the responsibility assigned by me to stay abreast of all that was going on.
He said, John, my files are clean. He said, I talked to Haldeman over the weekend, and I've gone through everything, and there's nothing there that's going to embarrass us. This was the most troublesome report I had had in my initial review of what was going on, because I said, if Strachan knows, Haldeman knows. If Haldeman knows, the president knows. So I looked around and I said, this place is in a world of hurt.
I said to Mitchell, what should I do with the gemstone files? And he said, I think you ought to have a fire in your fireplace tonight. Well, of course, it was late in June, a rather unusual time to have a fire, but that's what he wanted to do, and that's actually what I did.
Gordon commenced to tell us there were other things that had been done that we should be aware of. I said, well, what other things? He said, well, he said, we've had an operation going, or Hunt's had this operation going. We've done certain things for the White House.
Well, when he started disclosing all of these nefarious activities that he was involved in at the behest of the White House, and what he inferred was with the full authority of the President of the United States, just appalled me.
Mardian was throwing pencils up in the air and going whoosh, like that, and leaning over backwards in his chair and going forward, and just getting very excited and so on and so forth.
It was a frightening experience. I mean, here we are trying to zero in on, on the campaign, on McGovern, and now we find we've got, we've got all sorts of problems. I said, John, it's not just the Watergate. We have other potential problems here that could easily come up. And I guess we looked at each other, and at that point, we both knew those commitments had to be kept.
He was terribly chagrined that people in his organization could have engaged in such a thing, and that, as I recall it, he said, I just wasn't policing the people in my organization as well as I should have.
The President called me after I'd gone home. He called from his EOB office and mentioned the fact that he had talked to John Mitchell and told him not to worry about the Watergate stuff, that we'd probably may be able to keep it under control.
Herb Kalmbach was a close personal friend of mine, and I trusted him in every respect. So when he came to me and said he'd like to have all the money I could find up to $100,000, I said, I can't find $100,000, but I know where there is some money. But can you tell me anything more about it? He said, I can only tell you that it's a matter of the White House needing some money.
I got a call to come down to Washington and to meet with Mr. Herbert Kalmbach. So now he has an attaché case, and he's got 75 grand in there, and said, we'll be in touch. Now I'll await your instructions.
On that morning, Dean called me with a report, as he did from time to time when there was some development on Watergate, in which he said, and I'm reading from my notes here, my notes say, investigation out of control, Gray doesn't know what to do. Then I say, they've found money out of Mexican Bank. We'll know who the depositors were today.
On the evening of June 22nd, I met with Pat Gray over at his office in the FBI. And he now was convinced, after looking at everything, that the most likely explanation for what had gone on was this was a CIA operation that they'd stumbled into.
I said, now on the investigation, you know the Democratic break-in thing. I mean, it wasn't Watergate then. It was the Democratic break-in thing.
Now, on the investigation, the Democratic person thing, it's not the problem area because the FBI is not under control.
Again, I'm saying what Mitchell recommended and Dean concurred with, according to what Dean told me, is for us to have Walters is the deputy director of the CIA at that time, General Vernon Walters, call Pat Gray. Pat Gray was the director of the FBI at that time, acting director, and just say, stay the hell out of this. This is a business here we don't want you to go any further on.
And that will fit rather well because the FBI agents who are working the case at this point feel that's what it is the CIA.
He said, when you get in the people, say, look, this is the president now saying to me, look, the problem is that this will open the whole Bay of Pigs thing.
The problem is that this will
My purpose, my primary purpose, as is clearly indicated by the tape, and I don't dispute it at all, I wanted to stop the investigation, if possible.
We got word that Haldeman and Ehrlichman wanted to meet with Helms and Walters at 1 o'clock at the White House.
And we went in to see Mr. Ehrlichman, who talked in a general way about the embarrassment of this and so forth and so on, and people had shown excessive zeal, and then Mr. Haldeman came in.
The president has asked us to tell you that he wants, I think I said Dick Walters, to contact Pat Gray at the FBI and explain to them that exploring these Cubans and their ties and all that sort of thing, and the money source, may lead into all sorts of other things that we shouldn't be getting into, and that they should not go any further in that exploration. Helms, a typically cold as a cucumber, icy super spy type guy, came totally unglued.
Frankly, to this day, when I think back on that meeting, it's a long time ago, but it didn't seem to me that any of these things made any sense much.
And he finally calmed down, and they agreed that Walters would go talk to the FBI.
You know, in this government, if the president tells you that something is going on, you, at your own peril, decide right then and there that it isn't going on.
The case agent, the agent in charge, Angie Lano, came to me and told me that there'd been a halt. I'd asked him, you know, what was happening, what was going on with the investigation in Mexico, and Angie told me there'd been a halt put on it by the CIA.
I'm getting telephone calls from the Assistant United States Attorney, Earl Silbert, saying, Angelo, what's going on? And I'm saying, Earl, what can I tell you? Every time we want to do something, somebody says, hold. Wait, stop, no interview. Wait, hold, stop.
I realize that some of this material is extremely explosive politically. Some of it is probably direct evidence of crime. I went over to Ehrlichman's office to explain to him what we'd found in the safe.
And he told me that he had proposed to deliver these contents personally to Pat Gray, who was the acting director of the FBI, and leave it to Gray's discretion then, so that if there were an investigation of what became of Howard Hunt's possessions, we could very truthfully say that we had turned them over to the investigators. That seemed like a reasonable formula to me. I said, Gray is going to be in my office this afternoon at 5 o'clock. Why don't you bring him over then?
I distinctly recall Mr. Dean saying that these files were political dynamite and clearly should not see the light of day. It is true that neither Mr. Ehrlichman nor Mr. Dean expressly instructed me to destroy the files, but there was and is no doubt in my mind that destruction was intended.
The bill was being sent to a girl over in Alexandria, Virginia. So we said, well, that's strange. So we went to Alexandria and found out that she was an employee at the White House named Kathleen Chanel.
Immediately we realized that, you know, if she was broadsided by agents, no telling what she'd say. So we decided we had to find her first.
And I don't think the request was over here 5 or 6 hours when the telephone rang again and said, hold. And I said, on what? And they said, no interview of Chanel until the White House is going to bring her back.
Someone from the White House was coming to England to talk to me about a burglary in Washington, and that within 90 minutes I'd be back in London catching a plane back to Washington to be interviewed by the FBI.
We impressed upon her the importance to not spill the beans, if you will. We told her, first of all, these things were not relevant to the Watergate investigation.
He told me to answer all the questions truthfully and to the best of my ability, but to remember that I was under the cloak of national security, that I had had many top secret and intelligence clearances.
They came under this broad category of national security, which was a wonderful tool for us to sweep a lot of things that we didn't want out under the rug.
He called me and said he couldn't suspend us anymore. So I went to see him, and I said, I have carefully investigated this matter. There are no operations of the CIA that will in any way be jeopardized by this, and you're perfectly free to do them.
I called Pat Gray to congratulate the FBI on a very successful operation they had in apprehending some hijackers. He then brought up the subject of the Watergate investigation. He said that there are some people around you who are mortally wounding you, or might mortally wound you, because they're trying to restrict this investigation. I said, Pat, you go right ahead with your investigation.
Well, it's easy to miss the irony, perhaps, in this, which was that this whole thing was Richard Nixon's idea to involve the CIA in deflecting the FBI.
We called over to FBI headquarters, and we said, we identified another person, can you run this name? And within minutes, they come back and say, G. Gordon Liddy, former FBI agent. Well, you know, by now I'm going, you know, what is this? CIA people, FBI people, you know, what is it? You know, what is going on here? Who's hiring all these people and why?
The way the conspiracy appeared to us to be shaping up with Liddy at the top based on the evidence we had, if it went higher, and we didn't know whether it went higher, the logical person based both on position and responsibilities would have been Jeb Magruder.
Now, what I had to do was, number one, I had to go to the prosecutors and tell that story and make that believable, but number two, I had to have somebody to back it up.
Well, I refer to this as the sting. Was in my office, and Jeb came to the door and asked if I could join him in his office.
Well, I pitched it to Bart basically on the basis that I needed his help, that we were in a quandary, that this guy Liddy had gone off on his own, had done these things that had really created problems, but we had to have some way to justify giving him the money.
Basically, the bottom line was, if anybody asks you, it's kind of if anybody asks you, whether it was an attorney or whoever, anybody asks you, it would be helpful if you could remember a number like around $100,000 that we discussed at that time. And so without much ado, my big error, of course, was that I said, yeah, I would do that.
Federal indictments were returned in Washington today in the Watergate bugging affair.
Complaints. Sources here at the Justice Department say the investigation by both the FBI and the grand jury is over. There is no evidence, they insist, that anyone else was involved.
The last witness was called this morning, virtually guaranteeing there will be no trial before Election Day.
Now, my next guest, obviously, then, is the Attorney General of the United States. Will you welcome him, Richard Kleindienst? Who do you think gave the orders to bug the Watergate?
Well, I think that the persons who the grand jury indicted in Washington, D.C. last week gave the orders to do it. And I think one of the most interesting things about that, after having one of the most complete, comprehensive, intense investigations that the FBI has ever had, and one of the most thorough presentations before a grand jury, they came up with 7 persons who they indicted, you know. And I think that those are the persons who gave the orders to do that.
On September 15th, came back to my office, Jane, my secretary, said, "The President wants to see you over in the Oval Office." I was really quite surprised.
The basic reason for the meeting was to give John Dean a feeling that the President was pleased with his work and was thanking him for it, patting him on the shoulder and saying, "Good boy, well done."
In essence, the President said, "You know, just want to tell you what a good job you've done with the cover-up." What surprised me is I really, for the first time, began to see who Richard Nixon was in this meeting. He sort of let down and began to tell me about how we've got to get after our enemies that have done us wrong during this whole Watergate matter after the election.